Story 1. The quiet hum of the moving truck was the last whisper of my old life. I'd traded city grit for suburban promise, a charming little house with a sprawling, if overgrown, garden. It felt like a fresh start, a breath of clean air. That illusion lasted precisely until Mr. Silas, my next-door neighbor, introduced himself. He emerged from his own perfectly manicured lawn, a figure carved from pale moonlight and sharp angles. Gaunt and wiry, with a shock of stark white hair that perpetually looked windblown, even on a still day. His eyes, though, were what truly unsettled me. They were a watery, almost colorless blue, and they didn't so much look at you as they seemed to absorb you, leaving no detail uncatalogued. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he'd rasped, his voice dry like dead leaves. He didn't smile. Not really. His lips simply stretched, thin and bloodless, revealing a glimpse of uneven teeth. "I'm Silas. Mr. Silas." He stood there for an uncomfortably long moment, his gaze sweeping over my packed boxes, my open front door, even the half-unloaded trunk of my car. I offered a nervous smile, introduced myself, and he just nodded slowly, those pale eyes fixed on mine. "You'll like it here," he said, the words a flat assertion, not a comforting assurance. "It's very quiet." And then he turned and vanished back into his house, leaving me with a prickle of unease that the warm afternoon sun couldn't quite dispel. In the days that followed, the quiet of the neighborhood began to feel more like a hushed expectancy. Mr. Silas was always there, or rather, the sense of him was. A curtain would twitch in his living room window as I left for work. His porch light, usually off during the day, would flicker on and off as I pulled into my driveway in the evening. If I was out in the garden, he'd be out too, tending to his impeccable rose bushes, his back to me, yet I could feel his eyes, a cold pressure on my spine. My paranoia started small. A kitchen window I swore I'd locked would be slightly ajar. A garden hose I'd left coiled neatly would be draped haphazardly over a bush. I'd brush it off, blaming my own absent-mindedness. But the incidents accumulated, each one a tiny chip in my sense of security. One evening, I was struggling with a particularly stubborn branch in my backyard. I heard the faint rustle of leaves and turned to see Mr. Silas standing at the edge of his property, just beyond the fence line, watching me. He held a pair of gardening shears, but his hands were still, his body utterly motionless. "Having trouble, dear?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the evening cicadas. "Just this old tree," I replied, trying to sound casual. He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving me. "You know," he said, a strange, knowing glint entering his gaze. "You often wear that blue apron when you're gardening. It suits you. And you usually start around 6 on Tuesdays. Very dedicated." My blood ran cold. I rarely gardened on Tuesdays. And the blue apron was new. He couldn't have known this from casual observation. I forced a laugh, a dry, reedy sound. "Oh, just trying to keep a routine, you know?" He didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, a movement that was more avian than human, and then slowly began to trim a rose bush that didn't need trimming. I felt exposed, seen in a way that violated something deep within me. The true horror began about a month after I moved in. I was alone, curled up with a book, when I heard a faint, persistent scratching from the wall behind my bed, like tiny claws or fingernails. I dismissed it as a mouse, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It lasted for a few minutes, then ceased. The next night, it happened again, and the next. Always between midnight and 2 a.m. I started losing sleep. The scratching became a soundtrack to my nights, a constant, low-level dread. I'd lie awake, heart thumping, listening, trying to pinpoint its exact location. It seemed to come from directly behind my headboard. One morning, exhausted and jumpy, I decided to examine the outside wall of my bedroom. It was right next to Mr. Silas's property, separated by a narrow strip of my overgrown flower bed. As I pushed aside a particularly dense azalea bush, I saw it. Nestled amongst the leaves, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a small, crudely fashioned birdhouse. Not an actual birdhouse, but a hollowed-out log, no bigger than my fist, with a tiny, almost invisible opening facing directly towards my bedroom window. And protruding from that opening, glinting in the morning sun, was the lens of a miniature camera. My breath hitched. My entire body went numb. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and plucked the tiny birdhouse from its hiding place. It was warm from the sun, and surprisingly heavy. And then, as I held it, a small, folded piece of paper slipped from its base. My name was scrawled on it, in neat, precise handwriting. Below it, a single sentence. "I enjoy watching you sleep, dear." I dropped the birdhouse like it was burning me. The camera clattered against the damp earth. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, the world tilting on its axis. He hadn't just been watching. He'd been recording. For how long? Since I moved in? I became aware of a presence. I slowly lifted my head. Mr. Silas was standing on his porch, a watering can in his hand. He wasn't watering anything, just holding it, his pale, colorless eyes fixed on me. He wasn't smiling, but there was a subtle, knowing tilt to his head, a predatory stillness. He slowly raised his free hand and, with a precision that chilled me to the bone, brought his forefinger to his thin lips. A gesture of silence, a dark promise. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I could say. He hadn't harmed me physically. And who would believe the true depth of the horror, the insidiousness of the invasion? I went back inside, locked every door, every window, pulling the curtains tight. I ordered home security cameras, reinforced the locks, but I knew it was futile. The house, once my sanctuary, was now a cage. I still live here. I haven't seen Mr. Silas do anything overtly sinister since, but he's always there, a silent sentinel. I still catch glimpses of him through my reinforced windows, a figure in his meticulously kept garden, his head often turned towards my house. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint, rhythmic scratching against my bedroom wall, a silent promise. The quiet of the neighborhood is no longer comforting. It's a shroud, woven with dread, and I am forever trapped within Mr. Silas's watchful, unblinking gaze. Story 2. The moving truck had barely rumbled out of sight when I first saw him. I was wrestling a particularly stubborn box of books through the front door of my new house, sweat stinging my eyes, when I felt a gaze on me. I looked up, wiping my brow, and there he was. He stood on the porch of the house directly across the street, a gaunt figure silhouetted against the dying afternoon sun. His posture was unnaturally stiff, almost formal, despite the faded sweater he wore. He had a shock of stark white hair, combed neatly, and his face was a lattice of deep-set wrinkles. What struck me first, though, were his eyes. Even from that distance, I could feel their intensity, dark, unblinking pools that seemed to absorb all light, yet glittered with an unsettling knowingness. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched. I gave a hesitant, awkward wave, feeling a prickle of unease. He merely tilted his head, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and then slowly disappeared back into the shadows of his doorway. Well, that was welcoming, I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. His name, I would learn from a friendly, albeit gossipy, lady down the street, was Silas Croft. He'd lived there for decades, apparently, a recluse since his wife passed away years ago. "Keeps to himself," she'd said, her voice dropping conspiratorially, "but never causes any trouble. Just watches." That last word echoed in my mind. The watching began subtly, a flicker of movement in his window as I left for work, a rustle of leaves on his porch as I pulled into the driveway. Always, those dark, bottomless eyes. It was never hostile, never overtly threatening, but it was relentless. It felt like existing under a microscope, every mundane act scrutinized, catalogued. I started closing my blinds at night, a habit I'd never had before, a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of privacy. Then, things escalated. I started noticing small discrepancies around my house. A window I was certain I'd latched, now slightly ajar. A kitchen cupboard door left barely open, when I always closed them firmly. My keys, usually tossed onto the console table by the front door, would occasionally be found on the floor, as if they'd been dropped. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, the chaos of unpacking, but a cold knot of dread began to tighten in my stomach. One evening, I returned home to find a small, carefully wrapped package on my doorstep. It was a perfectly preserved dried flower, crimson petals still vibrant, tied with a thin black ribbon. No note. I knew instantly it was from Silas. My hands trembled as I carefully placed it in the bin outside, the idea of keeping it feeling wrong, invasive. The next morning, the flower was back on my doorstep. I confronted him, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I walked across the street, the air heavy with an unspoken tension, and knocked on his door. It opened silently, as if he'd been waiting. Silas Croft stood there, eyes fixed on mine. Up close, I could see the minute capillaries webbed across his irises, the faint tremor in his hands. He smelled faintly of dust and something metallic, like old coins. "Mr. Croft," I began, trying to keep my voice steady about the flower. "I appreciate the thought, but please don't leave things on my porch." A slow, deliberate smile stretched across his face, a silent widening of his thin lips that showed no teeth. It reached his ears, but not his eyes. His gaze remained as cold and hollow as ever. "It was lovely," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Just like your mother's. She always kept a vase of them by the fireplace." My blood ran cold. My mother had died when I was a child. She had indeed loved those specific flowers, long before I was born, a detail only a handful of family members knew. And she had never lived in this house, or even this town. How do you know that?" I whispered, my voice barely a thread. His smile widened, pulling the skin taut across his cheekbones. "Oh, I know many things. I've been watching for a very long time. Before you, there was a young couple. Before them, a family with 3 noisy children. Before them, another young woman who loved those same flowers, just like you." He paused, tilting his head again. "Every soul leaves a trace, you see. Sometimes they leave more than that. Something to remember them by. Something to keep." He held up his hand. Clutched in his palm was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was identical to one my mother had worn every day of her life, a locket that had been buried with her. My breath hitched. My entire body screamed. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but I knew with chilling certainty what he was truly watching. He wasn't just observing me. He was observing me being her. Or perhaps, he was observing the imprint of everyone who had lived in my house. And he wasn't just keeping things. He was keeping pieces. I stumbled backward, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. Silas Croft merely watched me, his smile never fading, his eyes dark, knowing, and utterly devoid of anything human. The locket glinted dully in his grasp. I locked every door, every window, but it made no difference. I could still feel his gaze, pressing against the very fabric of the house, against my skin. He wasn't just a creepy neighbor. He was a living memory, a grotesque curator of the past, and I was the latest exhibit in his horrifying collection. I didn't know what he was, or what he wanted, but I knew this. I was not alone in this house, and neither were its previous inhabitants. And Silas Croft was watching us all, always.